Hi, everybody. Welcome back to my channel, Numbers with Nora. This is a math tutoring channel that helps you out with all your math homework and needs. For this specific video, this is going to be my second video on statistics. We're still in chapter 1, and we're going to be doing lesson 1.2, observational studies versus design experiments. If you want to follow along in the same book I'm using Statistics by Michael Sullivan, 3rd edition. Here's the ISBN and everything. If you have questions on where to purchase this book for cheap or even how to get the PDF version, leave a comment and I'll let you know. Okay, so let's get right into it. So like I said before, mostly with all math, vocabulary is very, very important, especially with statistics. You're going to have to know these definitions in order to answer a lot of the questions that are going to come before. So the first thing I'm going to start with is vocabulary. So let's look at the first vocabulary word. It's going to be observational studies. And that's going to be a method of containing data where behavior is observed and not influenced or controlled. Okay. Then we're going to have designed experiments. That's a method of containing data where behavior is influenced and assigned to a certain group, right? So let's kind of dive in and see what that kind of means. So observational data is basically, it doesn't assign subjects to a group. An experiment is basically randomly assigned subjects to control a treatment group or treatment groups. So for my example of this one, say that for your observational study, you just want to study all people who like cat videos. That would be an observational study because I'm just studying all people. I'm not putting them in certain groups. For experiment, that's when I would say, okay, I want to have 2 groups where I have males and then females, and I see how they like cat videos. That would be an experiment because I sat there and created groups, okay, versus just having all people, right? So that's my kind of example for those, for observational studies and designed experiment studies. All right, so let's get on to the next 2 definitions. We have response variable. This is a type of dependent variable. Remember, in mathematics, dependent variables are variables that rely on something else, okay? So a type of dependent variable that changes the result, okay? And then an exploratory variable is a type of independent. Remember, in mathematics, independent doesn't rely on another variable. It's all by itself. It's good. So variable that explains the variation in response, in a response variable. So let's break this down with another example to try to understand it a little bit better. So my example here is the response variable. Or let me explain this more. So we have plants, right? In our experiments, we want to sit there and use different fertilizers, right? Here's my different fertilizers right here. I'm using 4 different fertilizers. And based on the fertilizer, I want to see how much my plant grows. So growth, okay? So we have growth. And then we have fertilizer. I'm just going to put for now for abbreviation. Those are my 2 variables of my experiment. So say I'm making a garden and I'm using the same plant, but I want to sit there and see how fast my plant grows based on what fertilizer I use, right? So in this experiment, I would sit there and say my response variable is actually going to be my growth of my plant because that's the response of my experiment, how my plants are responding. And I could say why they're growing. My explanatory variable are going to be my fertilizers, okay? So that's my example. So if I'm doing an example on plant growth and I'm using different fertilizers, the growth of my plant is my response of my experiment. And then the different types of fertilizers can be why I explained, or my exemplatory reason or variable why those plants grew in a certain way. right? So let's keep on going. Next, I'm going to have observational study. This is the research. This is when observational study is when the researcher observes the behavior of the individuals without trying to influence the outcome of the study. What I mean by influence is like change it, all right? And then we have designed experiment. This is when the researcher assigns individuals of a study to a certain group in which intentionally changes the value of the explanatory variable. All right, so let's dive a little bit more into that, and I'll use an example. We'll use the same plant example from up here. Okay, this plant example, keep that in mind. So example of this is different types of fertilization. Oops, yeah. So different types of fertilization was used. So this would be designed, right? So since different types of fertilization were used, that's different groups, right, of my explanatory variable. Because remember, in my plant example up here, my fertilization was my explanatory variable that explained why my plants grew, okay? And I had different explanatory variables that I can group, right? So that's designed. Now, an observational study, that's more of when I wouldn't have different types of fertilizers. I just have the same plant and I have the same fertilizer, and I just want to sit there and see how it grows. Okay. So, observational study, that basically means that I don't have different groups of fertilizer or explanatory variables. Okay, it's just one plain flat out study, right? Now let's go on for this next vocab, confounding. Okay, so this one, a variable that can potentially have an effect on the outcome of a study, but is not accounted for or eliminated. All right. So this one, it happens a lot in studies, and it's just variables that maybe you can't fit in your study, or uh, they're just not accounted for because you don't want to sit there and put that in the mix. Again, an example for this is if you wanted to do a study on lack of exercise and weight gain, that confounding variable could be um, how much one eats. Okay, so if you are doing a study on lack of exercise and weight gain, and you don't consider how much somebody eats as a variable, then that can be a confounding variable. Okay. Another one that's kind of similar is lurking variable. These are variables that are not included in the study but can affect the results. It's very similar to confounding. But the difference between the two is that a lurking variable in a study, um, the difference between the two is a lurking variable in the study can be considered unethical at times. And to avoid them, you can sit there and look at similarities and differences in your study, and you can possibly have them in there, but not. But they're not accounted for, or excuse me, variables that are not included in the study. You don't include them. I think that's the main difference. You don't include them. With confounding variables, you include them. Lurking variables, you do not include them in the study. Okay, that's the main difference. I would say that's the main difference. Okay. Right. So going on. Then we have confounding variables. Oops, excuse me. Then we have confounding variables. These are just extra variables that can have a hidden impact on the outcome being explored. It doesn't have any association with other explanatory variables, but does have impact on response variables. I guess an example for confounding variables, they're not included in studies, unlike the lurking variables. And let me give you an example. So the plan example. So an explanatory variable would be the fertilizer. So a confounding variable would be how much water each plant got, because it's something that is like an explanatory variable and it differs for each plant. I think that's the best way I can explain it. If you have more questions on this, let me know. That one can get a little confusing, and these ones can all kind of intertwine with each other. Okay. All right. So census, a survey of a population with certain characteristics of each individual. Usually you hear this in the news when they do a census of the United States. So basically they're taking so many people in the United States of different characteristics and seeing what they do, or giving them surveys to see how they respond. Okay. Another important thing in this section is types of observational studies. Okay. So there's 3 different types. There's going to be cross-sectional studies, case control studies, and cohort studies. All right. So for here, I have the definition of cross-sectional studies: an observational study that collects data about individuals over a certain period of time. An example of cross-sectional studies could be how COVID affected citizens in New York City. That could be like a short time study, because COVID was for a period of so many years, and you're considering just a certain group of people, so that can be a cross-sectional study. The other kind of study could be a case control study, an observational study that requires individuals to look back in time at an existing record. So again, this could sit there and be, I want to sit there and study a group of people that are smokers and they started smoking in 1989. Okay, that requires you to take the individuals to go back in time and look at what they were doing during that past time period. Okay. And then we have cohort studies. Cohort studies are an observational study that requires a group of individuals to participate in a study of a long period of time. So there is a famous one that they have in the book that they explain, but my example would be for a long study would be monitoring a group of, like I said, you can start by monitoring a group of people who were born in 2011, and you sit there for multiple years, study how they grow. And that could be a cohort study as well. All right. So that's just like a longer period of time study. I gave some examples while I was doing the definitions, so I'm not going to sit there and go over the book definitions again. If you have questions on the book definitions, drop a comment. I have no problem explaining them or writing you back. Also, in my next video, I'll do the practice for this section as well. And again, if you have any homework questions or would like further math help, please subscribe or leave a message in the comments section. Thank you, guys.